My story is about a passionate teacher who wants to help engage and motivate her students by making them more active, take a more active role in their learning process. And by engaging these students, it creates meaning and knowledge acquisition from these experiences. So the story begins talking about Miss Silva, who wants to actively engage her 6th grade class. She's preparing and planning tirelessly to have these lessons and activities for her students. So for her lesson one day, she wanted her students to develop a deeper understanding and use these critical thinking skills when it comes to thinking about where our food comes from and what's really in it. So she planned on activities where they can learn about the different corn-derived ingredients, their names, as well as to evaluate and analyze information from showing a film, from researching these ingredients, and reading nutrition labels that they're going to bring in. After reflection, she wants the students to also make an argument about these labels and their hidden ingredients. So that's where these critical thinking skills are coming in. And that is one of the constructivist teaching strategies that she's learning or using, Mrs. Silva began this activity by building from prior knowledge. And showing the class an image of a cheeseburger, French fries, and a milkshake, and then proceeding to ask them what these 3 foods have in common. So showing these pictures is drawing from past experiences in terms of just showing them something they're familiar with. She's showing them, foods that they see all the time, hopefully don't eat all the time, and asking them to think about it in a different way. She also shows them pictures of the many foods available at the grocery store, also building on this prior knowledge of all these foods, and then talking about that surprise, they all contain corn, which is surprising. So prior to this lesson, she had her students bring in different food labels that had nutrition facts on them. The next strategy she uses, she has them work on problem solving. So she hands out a list of these corn-derived ingredients and poses the question, what kinds of food typically contain these ingredients derived from corn? And she asked whether the students consider these foods healthy or not. So she designated each table group, a research group, and had them examine the labels that they brought in for any of these corn-based ingredients. So they're problem solving, as well as collaborating. So she implements collaboration by having the students work in these groups and determine the most common corn-based ingredients that they found from these labels. And then she had each group table state their findings to the class after creating a large chart. So Mrs. Silva, she's wanting to create a meaningful context for the activity to help emphasize her teaching and provide a real-world setting instead of this abstract instruction out of context. So this is really just creating an environment, an instructional learning environment. So to provide this case-based learning, she shows a clip from a documentary film since she can't just take them on a field trip to a corn processing plant, which would be great, but this film really places a meaningful context for them to understand and learn. So this collaborative learning involves communication between the students and their group. So she has them discuss how they felt about the idea that corn is hiding in these foods and often behind different names. And she had them discuss how frequently they even read and look at these nutrition labels on the foods they eat, as well as if people have the right to know what's in their food. So after this group discussion, Mrs. Silva had all the students individually write an argument essay. Not a long one, but just make an argument about whether or not people have the right to know what's in their food, and then supporting their view with reasons and information that they learned. So she thought to herself, students would benefit from this near transfer of these persuasive writing skills to other subjects. So now Mrs. Silva is thinking about transfer of learning strategies, and near transfer is a rather easy one. So she knows they'll write argument papers in many different subjects and classes. But the far transfer she does comes later. Okay. Mrs. Silva also wanted to implement explicit teaching so her students can apply what they learned to other parts of their lives. So after they wrote this argument essay, the teacher had the groups talk about how they could use these persuasive skills that they used to write their essays in the future to, for example, convince someone to hire them for a job. They're only in 6th grade, but in high school they'll probably be applying for jobs, or persuade their future boss for a raise. Now, the far transfer is harder for Ms. Silva. So that's why it was finally time for lunch, and that students were hungry after all this critical thinking that they did. So Mrs. Silva began to set up her next lesson on percentages. Whew, that's hard. She hopes that for this to be a far transfer of knowledge, so that her students will be able to use this to determine discounts on a sale, use percentages, and apply it to determining a discount on a sale when they're buying clothes, which Mrs. Silva didn't even learn how to do until later in life. Also for math, Mrs. Silva had already worked a lot with her students on fractions to be able to understand percentages. And in order for them to understand fractions, she worked a lot with them on it, by the way. She felt like analogies and metaphors really helped teach them these abstract concepts of fractions. And she used the classic analogy of pizza slices to teach her students a great visual that helped her students understand. She had one more transfer of learning strategy up her sleeve. After her history lesson on the civil rights movement, she asked her students what elements are needed to create a successful social change in human rights movement. So this generalizing that she does is pushing her students to form these broader principles from the specific situation, the civil rights movement. So she knew that generalizing this the specific situation would help apply learning from this to another. So she also had her class research different social change in human rights movements. So Mrs. Silva, she's so passionate about conservation as well, of course, and wanted her students to understand problems faced by endangered species globally, and wanted to teach them about the Endangered Species Act and all this good stuff. But she felt like this wasn't enough, and that she wanted to actively have her students participate in this learning experience and acquire this knowledge through cooperative education. So she partnered with the local zoo and had them immersed and physically active in learning about these endangered animals and what is immediately threatening them. She had heard of the situated learning and wanted her students to be actively involved in addressing these real world problems. So she assigned different animals and zookeepers to these different groups to gather information and data on their animals, and just gather information about what conservation efforts are being done. I mean, these are real world problems, and they're going to write a research paper as well on it. She was really happy to watch her students' knowledge be acquired situationally because being there, they were constructing knowledge as in their experiences through this hands-on learning situation. And they were challenged to use their critical thinking skills, brainstorming prior to going to the zoo, questions to ask the zookeepers about their animals and what they can do to help. As well as just the daily duties of the zookeepers, and kind of helping them out with their these real activities, work activities. So because of Mrs. Silva's wonderful teaching strategies, her students became successful from this social interaction because learning is a result of social process. And learning takes place through these relationships between people and connecting, this knowledge from these experiences with authentic learning. And by being immersed in this social community, the students unintentionally learn the virtue of stewardship of the world. And Mrs. Silva's goal for the field trip was to be this facilitator of learning, because she knew that by guiding and assisting her students, they would learn more. And just by offering scaffolding and advice and support when necessary, helped her students actively learn from the experience, with these social interactions with the workers at the zoo and their groups. And that is the end of my story.